Let's review what you will need to know about the Russian Federation. To date, Russia is the largest country in the world, spanning 11 time zones, and over 80% of its population is today ethnically Russian. It is known for an abundance of petroleum, as well as iron and timber. Its largest trade partner, with over 50% of its exports each year, goes to the European Union, while also having a strong trade relationship with the country of China. Following the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and the death of Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin, the Soviet Union came under the leadership of Communist Joseph Stalin in 1922. In the Stalin years, which would lead up into the early 1950s, a series of reforms would make the country much more industrialized and urbanized, as many people left their more traditional agricultural-based jobs and roles to go to more developed cities where industry was booming. This led to a higher level of education for Soviet citizens and increased levels of health care. However, a long period of time of being an isolationist country led to a highly underdeveloped economy in the later stages of the 20th century, in which globalization was not permitted, and thus the quality of Soviet goods had taken a downturn. In turn, the labor force was also highly unmotivated, as they had no opportunity to own their own business and grow. Very strict controls were put on place of civil society, with large chunks of the Soviet population being arrested and even slaughtered by Stalin's leadership. There was also mass levels of corruption in the Soviet government, under a system known as nomenclatura, which had also been used by the Chinese government. In this system, highly unqualified people were rewarded with government jobs in return for staying loyal to the communist regime. With a stagnant economy and a series of unhappy citizens, by the late 1980s the Communist Party in the Soviet Union went a different direction, electing a leader who was unlike many before him. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev proposed two major reforms that would change the face of the Soviet Union and would in turn eventually lead to its collapse. These two reforms were known as Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost was the idea of more openness, as Gorbachev called for a more transparent government that promoted more free and open thinking and civil society. The result was far more open protests throughout the Soviet Union, particularly by younger members of the country, as well as other satellite nations such as that of East Germany, where the Berlin Wall would fall by the end of 1989. Perestroika also called for more economic restructuring and more decentralization of the economy. The results of this, however, were mixed. There were some minor improvements throughout the Soviet economy. However, some of the more traditional rules like price controls and production plans stayed in place, making any gains that were created through decentralization minimal. By the early 1990s, the clash between communist traditionalists and democratic reformers was finally brought to a halt with the ratification and acceptance of the new constitution of the country, no longer calling itself the Soviet Union, but officially calling itself the Russian Federation, electing its first popularly elected president, Boris Yeltsin, in 1993. The new Russian constitution, which had been approved through a national referendum, which was based on citizen-wide consensus, called for the following things: free and open elections, a system of checks and balances that promoted open civil society with free expression, a more market-based economy, and continued state leadership, including state-owned healthcare, housing controls, and state universities. Russia's transition from being a more state-controlled communist-style economy to a more market-based and open economy was done virtually overnight, through what many economists call shock therapy economics. Shock therapy economics reflects a couple of principles: a sudden release of government price controls, the withdrawal of many state subsidies, the immediate inclusion into the global trade market through liberalization, and large-scale efforts to privatize many previously state-owned assets, as Russia did with the use of privatization vouchers, trying to encourage many Russian people to begin their own businesses. The initial results of shock therapy economics in Russia were horrendous, as many Russians lost their life savings and became highly impoverished. Many of the businesses that Russians began to open failed immediately, as the citizens lacked the knowledge and resources necessary to conduct business. Perhaps the worst result, however, were the small pockets of business and political elites who came to monopolize the economy by having full control of some of the most precious assets within the country. They became immensely wealthy at the expense of the Russian citizenry. This became known as a system of oligarchs during the Yeltsin years. With mass charges of corruption pending in his administration and dwindling health, President Boris Yeltsin made history in the year 2000 by announcing that he would be stepping down as the Russian president. He named his successor as a little-known former KGB agent and low-level Russian bureaucrat by the name of Vladimir Putin. Over the next decade, Putin would transform and in many cases reverse a lot of the democratic gains of the 1990s. Putin would come to call his style of leadership sovereign democracy, meaning that the principles of democracy were in place, but would be adjusted to reflect more Russian mindsets and ideals than those of the West. During the Putin years, we have seen a huge increase back in state control of the economy, as the economy has taken back many sectors and control of the natural resources, making the economy a bit more unstable when it comes to globalization. There have been higher restrictions on civil society and less open free expression. It has included a heightened sense of Russian nationalism, centered around a conflict with Chechnya in the early years of Putin's administration. His cabinet has become large, bloated, and corrupt, as he filled it with many former security or military-based personnel in a term that is known as Silovki. State control and ownership of mainstream media has been a major base of the Putin years. Putin took control of the media and brought it under state control for a variety of reasons, including trying to target business oligarchs who previously made all of their wealth in the media. He also wanted to keep up his state's legitimacy through the use of the news, and to suppress all political opposition that might come his way, both within his own country and around the world. The Russian executive branch is known as a dual executive or semi-presidential system, in that it has two executives, both a president and a prime minister. The president, who is actually the head of state, is popularly elected by the people and can serve up to 2 consecutive 6-year terms as changed as part of a referendum in the 2012 amendment to the Constitution. The President is responsible for various things, including signing treaties that have to be approved by the Federation Council, issuing decrees as policy, vetoing legislation, granting pardons. He is the commander-in-chief of the military, though all troop deployments also have to be approved by the Federation Council. He's able to call the legislature into session, and he also is responsible for appointing his executive partner, the Prime Minister, with the approval of the State Duma. The Prime Minister's term is consecutive with that of the President who has appointed him. He can be removed, however, by 2 repeat votes of no confidence in the State Duma in a 3-month period. The Prime Minister is considered the head of government, though realistically in Russia, President Putin seems to serve both functions. The Prime Minister is a policy specialist who is responsible for preparing the annual budget. He does get to appoint his own cabinet members with the approval of the President and oversee all of the economic and domestic policy throughout the country. The current Prime Minister in Russia is former President Dmitry Medvedev. The Russian parliament is bicameral, meaning that it does have 2 chambers. All of the elected members of either chamber are elected through a system of national proportional representation that allows for a higher level of competition for minor political parties. Most political scientists, however, would still say that the Russian legislature is not the key player in policy formation in comparison to the executive branch, as they would still consider the Russian parliament to be a rubber stamp to the executive branch, particularly during the Putin years. The lower house or State Duma is responsible for approving the appointment of the Prime Minister. They also can remove that Prime Minister through 2 consecutive votes of no confidence in a 3-month period. They are responsible for approving the budget and all taxation policies and proposing constitutional amendments. The upper house or Federation Council is really the foreign policy specialists. They approve all treaties entered into by the President, as well as any troop deployments the President requests, as well as declaring war. They also have the authority to try an impeached executive. The Russian legal system is a unique breed, as it does not really use code law, but does not utilize the common law systems that are used in places like the United States and UK. It's rather a series of statutory laws and provisions that govern this legal system. The Russian Constitutional Court is the highest court of the federal government. It does exercise the power of judicial review in allowing it to check actions by the President and by the legislature. However, that power is very rarely utilized, as most of the judges have been appointed and controlled by the governing body and the state that's in power. Thus, the court system has very little sovereignty and political independence. Elections in Russia today are very federally controlled, and although there is an electoral commission, it is anything but independent and considered highly fraudulent. Civil society is censored and controlled very much by the federal government. Thus, many would argue that the current Russian system is one that would be called soft authoritarianism. In contrast to traditional authoritarianism, soft authoritarianism has elements of political competition and expression. They do exist, however, there are many mechanisms that are going on behind the scenes to make sure that the dominant party is never really in fear that they're going to lose power. In essence, we would say that Russia's democracy is more procedural than it is substantive. We would also call this an illiberal democracy or a hybrid regime because it allows for open elections to make the public think that there's a legitimate state in place, although there's high levels of corruption going on behind the scenes. Despite all of this, voter turnout in Russia is amongst the highest in the world. Political socialization is the lifelong process that occurs in helping us to form our political beliefs, values, and identity. Most of the agents of political socialization in Russia are common to other places throughout the world, while there are a few that are more unique to the country itself. Some of those methods of socialization are the state-controlled media, the curriculum in the education system that was run and created by the state, family values and customs, which remains the largest way of socialization, fears over economic uncertainty and national security, and of course the Russian Orthodox Church. However, it is important to note that religion plays a smaller role in the political identity of Russians compared to other places in the world. Russia is considered today to be a multi-party system because its electoral system, that of national proportional representation, allows for the competition of multiple parties. In reality, however, United Russia is the dominant political force. This is for two reasons: its direct link and association with President Vladimir Putin, and his use of clientelistic networks in the media to manipulate, control, and maintain the party's legitimacy. There are, however, opposition parties, and two of the largest include the Communist Party and the Yablokos, although the Yablokos have recently fallen behind the 7% threshold needed to maintain the ballot for the next election cycle. The Yablokos became a major competitor in the early 1990s in the first decade of post-communist rule because they pushed for more open and democratic processes. They opposed Yeltsin's administration for the high levels of corruption and the oligarchs who formed. They have heavily opposed Vladimir Putin's administration for a variety of reasons, including that they want a better relationship with the European Union and the United States, they want more protection of civil liberties, but most importantly because they want more economic liberalization and less state control. Though Russia is considered a federal republic, its style of federalism isn't exactly balanced. It's what we call asymmetrical federalism. Asymmetrical federalism is the idea that a federal system is in place, meaning that they do have multiple levels of government. However, many of those subnational levels are given more or less individualism, authority, and autonomy than other regions. During the Putin years, policies have catered much more towards Western Russia and the more urbanized and industrialized areas, such as the capital in Moscow and in St. Petersburg. During the Vladimir Putin years, he has exercised a great deal of control over each of the regional leaders and their governing styles. He created the State Council by decree in 2000 to give him more authority and control over regional governors. Today, regional governors are no longer popularly elected as a means of which Putin can control the types of policies that are implemented at the lower levels. In looking at the Russian economy today, it is struggling to say the least, especially considering its potential to be a major world player given all of its natural resources. The increase of state control in the economy during the Putin years has led to less competitive and efficient production. Urban residents have made out far better than rural residents, and wage gaps, particularly between men and women, have continued to grow out of control. Outdated infrastructure and technology makes Russia a very unattractive place today for a lot of foreign direct investment. Many Russians to this day still question the validity of the market economy based on their common experiences. Russia did hope to break through, however, by getting membership into the World Trade Organization after 20 years of attempts. In 2012, Russia was officially granted membership as the 156th member of the WTO. The hope was to reduce trade barriers with other nations, promote more peace and cooperation, and cut living costs to raise the standard of living. Progress in all of these areas, however, has not really been achieved fully because of a series of foreign policy decisions that have been made in places like Ukraine and in Syria. Russia is faced with several modern challenges that it will have to overcome in the next century, one of which is realizing its full economic potential. It also needs to find a way to become a more democratic society as the balance between the old Russia and new Russia continues to conflict. Abuses of civil liberties for various groups, including women, gays and lesbians, as well as ethnic minorities, continues to perpetuate under the Putin administration. They also have to still achieve a true level of political competition and political transparency that has been highly compromised by state control during the Putin years. They also need to find a way to strike more constitutional balance between the various branches, as the legislature remains very much a rubber stamp group. This includes the judiciary, which needs to find a way to become more independent from political influences, as well as a very, very inept bureaucracy. But perhaps the biggest challenge Russia still has to overcome is its high levels of corruption. Since 1995, a non-governmental organization known as Transparency International releases an annual report with an index number that measures the perceived level of corruption in 175 states across the world. 0 is a score meaning that there is very high corruption, all the way up to 100, which means very low levels of corruption. In the most recent report in 2014, Russia's Corruption Perceptions Index number came in at 28, placing it number 136 of the 175 states measured. Scoring the best with a 92 was the European nation of Denmark, while tied for the worst with a score of 8 were the nations of Somalia and North Korea.